morning, ECOS Line Team. Welcome aboard episode 53. We got Mr. Jimmy Vaughn here. He's going to be talking about what your legacy is going to be. And man, privileged to have Jimmy come here. I think this is your third time, Jimmy? Third time? And he's drove all the way from Louisiana to be here and bring this to you all. So this is serious stuff. Senior consultant with ISPC, Institute for Safety and Powerline Construction. Institute for Safety and Powerline Construction, they contribute about 8 speakers a year for this cause, ECOS, for electric culture of safety, for your line team back home. They pay for it. You all don't pay for this. They do, and they're giving back to our industry. It's amazing. After 2.5 years now, electric culture of safety, we have about 14,000 plus members. It's crazy. And Jimmy, you're one of the guys I spoke to firsthand almost 3 years ago about this idea. And I spoke to you and Matt Turner at the table at the Incident Prevention in Dallas. And I told you guys about the idea, Danny Raines, and you all said, yeah, we're in, we're going to do it. And I didn't expect everybody would say, let's do it, but everybody said, let's do it. And it's amazing what's going on here. And Jimmy, you've got what, 50 plus years of experience?
Yeah, I think it's 52, but I'm losing track.
52 years. And we were talking earlier, and you've investigated how many incidences more or less now?
700.
About 700. That's amazing. So you know firsthand the ins and outs of these incidences and what's going on out there in line work, firsthand. How did you get started, Jimmy? Give us a little background of when you started about 52 years ago. What happened?
Well, I started my career on the back of a line truck as a helper on the back of a pole truck, and spent almost the first year, which is the way that it happened. Mm-hmm. You know, back then, Danny Raines and I really came up about the same time. We both came up almost the same way. And then typically you would bid jobs. You go to a truck driver helper and a winch truck operator, and then into your apprenticeship. And the apprenticeship will last about 4 years. And then you get into your line side journeyman lineman. And then from there, I left. All that was at Florida Power and Light. Left Florida Power and Light, went into contracting side of the business, got my bare hand qualification, and then moved into supervision and foreman. You know, doing transmission construction mostly. Yeah. And then during the Clinton administration, the construction industry took a little bit of a hit, and so I left the industry and went back to college and decided to finish a Bachelor of Science degree, and thought I was going to come out and teach, and ended up coming out and teaching in the industry, which was what it was. Somebody put an ad in the paper looking for a lineman with 10 years of line experience and a college degree, which to most people is the worst thing in the world. A know-it-all lineman with a college degree. That nobody wants to have that in your backyard. But that's exactly what they were looking for, and I didn't know it was supposed to be hard. And so I established the first community college-based transmission distribution program for high school and college students. Wow. And we were embraced by several utilities that helped to support it. I started 2 more, and then I ended up back in the industry, in the safety side of the business, training, and of course, part of that is doing those investigations when things go wrong.
Wow. So now with ISPC, you've been with them for how long now? For a while.
Since I was supposed to have retired.
Yeah.
So it's been about a little over 8 years.
Nice. Nice. And ISPC, what type of services do you all, I kind of know, but for the folks, what type of services do you all provide?
We write training programs. We write particular programs like hot stick programs, bare hand programs. We write and revise safety manuals, you know, for the industry. So we do a lot of the soft skills stuff, but we also do transmission hot stick, distribution hot stick training. That's one of the areas that I usually work in. We do bare hand training, and then I also handle all of the litigation services either as a consultant in incident and the incidents that occur where we usually represent the utility of the contractor in their dealings with OSHA, and then If it becomes a civil litigation, we end up being a consultant and or expert witness. So we end up re-investigating those serious incidents and creating understanding the root cause and then presenting that evidence in trial in the courtroom.
Very nice. Well, folks, you're in for a treat. Pay attention, and you're going to glean a lot from what Mr. Jimmy is going to be sharing today. And Jimmy, we appreciate you all coming here.
Well, listen, we appreciate Bureau and ECOS making this platform available. We thought it was a great idea. It just needed somebody that would put the work into it to make it happen, and then you jumped onto it. And I remember when the first of our brochures came out, and there was like 4 or 5. Logos for the supporting industry, and then next thing you know, there's no more room for any more logos. And it really has taken off because it's a quality product, and it's given us an opportunity to share on a more intimate level with a whole lot of people at one time. Normally when we go out and we do a presentation, whether it's soft skills or hard skills, we're with 10, 20 people. And this way we can get to thousands of people with messages that make a difference. And that's something that we really need right now. And that's something that we're going to discuss in today's presentation. We're going backwards on safety. So.
No, that's awesome, Jimmy. Well, appreciate you coming here, brother.
Thank you, Brent.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, what will your legacy be? Most people don't think about that very much, but see, it's not just that you're going to be a lineman or a truck driver or a winch truck operator or whatever it is. There's going to be an end to your career. And the question that I'm asking now is, what will your legacy be? What will you leave behind? And then the second question is, how are you going to get there? In other words, what's the path going to be? When I was teaching in college, I used to do a session called Your Personal Mission Statement. And what I asked my students to do was to look at the end of your life. What do you want your legacy to be? And how do you want to get there? What do you want to be recognized for? What is the pathway that you're going to take to get there? Is it going to be a pathway of affected by your religion, by your culture, by your family? But whatever it is, it's going to be affected by the choices that you make. So in other words, what I asked them to do is to do a tailboard. What are we going to build, and how are we going to build it, and how are we going to do it safely? So this is a perspective that we find out that's missing in our industry, and in particular from my point of view as somebody who both did line work for 20 years, growing up as a lineman with the same attitudes that a lot of linemen have when it comes to safety. As a matter of fact, OSHA was not created until after I had become a lineman. So it was a huge change for our industry to have a third party come in trying to tell us how to do line work, and we didn't respond to it. We didn't respond to it very well. So the first thing that I want you to do is to park your preconceived ideas about the safety man and safety. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, go to any of these websites for line workers and linemen where people are allowed to put in comments, and look and see how many of those comments are critical of safety and the safety persons, or what the safety people do. And you're going to see that not everybody is working hand in hand with the ideas for safety. There are an awful lot of people out there who think that they know better. I have a kind of a funny story to tell. When I went to work for a contractor, and I was kind of new there, and as a safety guy on a construction site, and there was about 200 people there, and I was introduced at one of the wood structures that were there, and this guy made a snide remark about another safety guy who didn't know what he was doing. So I borrowed his climbers and his belt, and I scaled a 60-foot pole, and then came back down again, and I said, "Got any other comments to make?" I did know what I was doing. He just made the assumption that because I was a safety guy that I didn't know line work. Well, I do know line work, and I know line work a whole lot better now over the last 52 years, especially in the last 30 years where I have been doing these investigations. So that's the first thing I want you to do, is I want you to put aside any preconceptions. I want you to listen closely to what I'm getting ready to share with you. Because after 52 years, I've now become an expert in the attitudes about the people who I deal with. Because see, every investigation that I do, I interview everybody that was involved. And in these litigations and in these OSHA investigations, I investigate people sometimes 2 and 3 years after the incident occurred. But I get a very good impression about what people think of themselves and what they think of the safety culture. I want to give you an example. I made a big deal one time out of a tailboard sheet that had 22 people on the safety meeting, and one guy, when he wrote his name, wrote his first name and his last initial. Now at the top of the column, it said, "Print your full name." And he wrote his first name and his last initial. And then it said, "Signature, please write legibly." And he had sort of a squirrely squirrel that was in there. You couldn't tell what that said. I only knew that it was his signature because it was on the line where his first name was. That day, that guy had a flash and hurt himself, doing something his own way, violating, thinking that he had a better way of doing it, and the rules didn't apply to him. So when we look at human performance, we might get an impression simply by looking at his cooperation with the process that he had an attitude that might work against him when it came to his safety on the job site. It's really almost that simple. But don't give up on me yet. You may have already been preconceiving some ideas, but I want to warn you, don't do that. Follow me through and let me give you a good explanation. Now, what has really started to bother me, and I just mentioned this a minute ago with Brent, is that we are seeing a rise in the number of incidents and fatalities in our industry, even though we have more active safety programs than we ever have before. So you see in the box what I wrote here, you and I need to consider all aspects of the contributing factors. And today I'm going to share a couple contributing factors that I have seen in all 700 investigations that I have done, including the some 35 fatal investigations that I've done over the last 30 years. And if you're a safety person or an investigator or a trainer or who writes training materials, this is something that I want you to pay very close attention to, because this is almost like human performance, which has become valuable to us in helping to determine what kind of workers may be more prone to taking chances than others will, simply by observing what's going on. But the good part is I have a solution too. Look at this picture here. What I want you to look is look over on the right-hand side of this structure. And if you look at the second arm from the top, you'll see a 3-bundle traveler, and then you'll see that the conductor is hanging straight down, and you'll see a whole bunch of rigging, and you'll even see a set of Moorpack blocks with a 3/4 38,000-pound rated rope, and then you'll see the other end of that rope hanging right here. They were doing a mid-span splice, taking out back-to-back Kellums. It was in the air, and they were going to be putting them together, and they had them stretched out between a set of Moorpack blocks, which is one of the best sets of blocks that we can use in the industry. And then there was a crew at this lower arm getting ready to clip that traveler, clip those conductors in, when the rope in the Moorpack blocks failed. The rigging ran out, and all of the rigging come flying back to the structure and hit the basket where the 2 men were clipping in. Now, that's a serious thing that happened, but there were 2 key elements to this incident. One was that it was our policy, and this is an age-old policy is that when you're clipping and when you're splicing conductors in the air, you always leave at least 2 spans of conductor in between those 2 operations. And the reason for doing that is so that you have time to react if something does go wrong, and that 2 spans of conductor acts like a buffer. You don't have that Morpack set of blocks coming back at you at 60 or 70 miles an hour, weighing 85 pounds, is slamming into the basket and breaking both of the apprentice's arms, which is exactly what happened. The apprentice didn't know the sound. The lineman recognized the sound, knew it wasn't right, grabbed the apprentice, pulled him down into the safety of the basket, but his arms were still hit by the flying material. Now, on the other end, where the blocks were broke, we see the real level of frustration because we're putting a lot of time into safety and improving it, and it's not working. Look at this rope. This is the rope that was in the Morpack blocks. Now, these weren't part-time linemen who came out of nowhere, and this is also one of the things that I want you to put behind trying to think that there's a difference between union linemen and non-union linemen. That's not what we're talking about here today. In this case, these were JATP trained linemen with 4-year apprenticeships, and on this crew was more than 100 years of transmission experience. But every day they use this set of blocks to pull slack into those back-to-back Kellam grips to splice that conductor together. And they did it so often, and they walked past this rope so much, they totally lost awareness of the condition of that rope until it finally broke. And even when the people involved in the incident looked at the rope, they just shook their heads in disbelief that they had allowed it to get in that condition. But here's what they were doing. Every day they were pulling that same 30 feet of rope through those blocks over and over and over and over until that rope began to wear. When we tested that 38,000 pound rated rope, that's the maximum rating on the rope, it broke at 2,700 pounds because it had a bad spot. It finally wore out. When you see it fluffy like that with all the edges, that's a bad rope. It needs to be replaced. But we just got so used to it, we walked right past it. In other words, they weren't doing the things that they were supposed to do every day. I want to share some numbers with you. Department of Labor for 2023, that 499051, that's a craft number for utility journeyman. Last year in 2023, the Department of Labor has 55 fatal incidents in our industry. And that's nowhere close to what it actually is because municipalities don't report to DOL. This DOL number comes from OSHA. Municipalities don't report. So all of the thousands of municipalities all around the country that may or may not have had a fatality didn't report it. So that 55 fatal incidents in 2023 is probably not accurate. There were probably many more than that. All total, workplace fatal injuries went up 5.7% last year, even though everybody, including OSHA, is concentrating and putting more time and work into trying to stop these incidents from occurring. They're still continuing to go up, no matter how smart we seem to get about safety. So I want you to look at this. Can't tell you where it's at because this is from one of my litigation files, but it's a very, very important photograph. This is a bucket, and you see the bucket has burned off completely. And you know why? Because nobody on that crew knew that that bucket did not have an electrical rating. Why is that? It's fiberglass. It's on the end of a fiberglass boom. But I'll bet you, because I talk to people all the time, especially when we write policies, most all of them think that a fiberglass bucket is non-conductive bucket. But if you get it between phases, even if one's in a hose, guess what? Arcing can start across that bucket, can get into the hydraulics, and then that's what happens. I have 5 cases just like that. And in every one of those cases, that fiberglass bucket, what got in between phases purposely because they thought it was an insulating fiberglass bucket. It's not. It's simply made of fiberglass. But if you were to read A92, the standard for the construction of fiberglass aerial devices, you find out that the fiberglass bucket has no electrical rating. It doesn't get tested. You can't put a clip on the lip of a bucket and pick up a voltage or a current leakage at the other end, because it's only picking up a pathway from that clip down that boom. It's not testing the surface of that bucket. And what has happened in each one of these cases is that there were 2 points of contact. One of them might have been a ground or a neutral or a cross arm, and then they had a phase laying on the bucket in a rubber hose. And when you put a rubber hose in compression, guess what happens to that rubber hose? Once you lay the weight of that phase on top of that bucket and you try to pick it up, you're putting that hose in compression. Guess what? That hose no longer has an electrical rating to it because they are not designed to be used in compression. And then they start to leak, and voltage starts to leak across, and a small current starts to leak across, and it burns a hole in something, and it starts a hydraulic fire. And even though that is high dielectric fluid, it is not flammable. It is not inflammable. It is flammable. It will burn. It is not going to burn simply because it caught fire. So, and if you look at these numbers right here, and you'll see that in the electric power generation, transmission, distribution, this is numbers again that come, and these are not easy to find, and they also are not absolute for the same reason that I told you before, because municipalities don't report. And I can't guarantee you that everybody else reports, either. But the numbers that the DOL has that they get from OSHA says that in the electric power generation and distribution world, there was an average of 59 fatalities from the years 2011 to 2015. And if you look at the non-fatal injuries in our industry, you see 2011, 1380, 2012, 1110. Oh, it's going down. 2013, 650. Oh man, this is great. We're heading in the right direction. And then in 2014, OSHA came out with the final rule, which was a revision of our safety standards to improve them. And look what happened. We jumped from 650 non-fatal incidents to 1,180. And then look at the last year in that record, 2015, 1,100. So in 23-24, the fatalities ranged from 43 to 55, somewhere around there in those 2 years, per 100,000 workers that were on the job. And non-fatal serious injuries are less than 2,000, but they are above 1,100. So we're going in the wrong direction. So I asked the question, what is it? What's going on? Why are we getting more enthusiastic about safety with programs and having tailboards and all that other kind of stuff, and still it's not making a difference? Well, here's what's happening. You're doing it wrong. And I'm going to explain why and what the source is for why we're doing it wrong. Remember the things that we've just been talking about? The couple of mistakes that were made, walking past that rope every day. Fiberglass bucket that's not conductive, but they're treating it as if it is an insulator, and it's not an insulator. Take a look at this one. This has created several incidents, and I'm going to point out something very close that I want you to see. But first thing to look at is right here. This is a taped up clamp, and you can see what we have here is a guy dead end that was being used as a pulling clamp for a guy wire. Now, the day before this happened, this construction crew lost control of this conductor and they dropped it. That was the one that you saw with the flying set of blocks. Now, they had to try to get it all back up. So they had two spans that there was between the conductors that were laying on the ground, and the conductors are really damaged, and you can see how damaged these conductors are. So what they had to do in order to get this conductor wound back up is they had to get it back up in the air. So we've got the two ends out there, and we need to close that gap. We call that marrying the two. So they stretched out a 3/16 or a 1/4 inch guy wire in between the two. And then they used a guy dead end through a swivel onto that guy wire in order to create a link between those two conductors and pull that conductor back up in the air. And 2/3 of the way of getting it pulled, that guy preformed dead end slipped. The guy wire pulled out of it and the wire fell again. Why did that happen? Now, my first response was, I say, I don't know how that happened, because when I was a lineman, I found out that a guy grip turned around backwards on a guy. I could put a hoist in it, and I could be sure that that guy grip wasn't going to slip. And sometimes those guy grips that we had for that would bounce and slip. So it's just easy to wrap a guy grip around it, put a hoist in it, put a hoist on the other end, and pull that guy backed up on a guy grip. Only we're not supposed to do that. And there's a very good reason for that. If you look very, very closely, you'll see right here in the middle, you'll see that orange band right there that indicates the size. And then if you go back up toward that swivel, you'll see a gap in the strands. You see that gap in the strands? That gap's not supposed to be there. These are heat-formed dead ends that are designed to wrap around that strand conductor, and they are intimately in contact with each other, and each one of them produces a certain amount of grip, and they push against each other, and they maintain that grip on the strand. But if you look, you'll see there's a gap between those two strands. The reason there's a gap between those two strands is because this eye that was formed in the guy grip when it was heat formed at the manufacturer was formed to fit around a certain size anchor head, not the 5/8 bolt in the swivel. And when they put tension on that preform stretched out. And when it did, it changed the alignment of the strands, and now all of the strands were not intimately grabbing that strand. So once they put enough strain on it, even though they had a clamp on the other end, the guy strand pulled out and the wire came to the ground. Now, if you read the instructions that came with the guy grip, you would find out it says don't use this as a tool such as a dead end or a grip to pull conductor. Use this one time as a permanent installation and don't use it as a guy grip. Now, that's kind of funny because if you hang OPGW, some of the OPGW manufacturers recommend using a guy strand grip as a grip to dead end OPGW. Now, if you call up Hughes or one of the manufacturers that makes these preforms, they'll say, oh no, you can't do that. But here you got a manufacturer saying that you are, that's what you're supposed to use because it's cheaper than a purse grip to grab that OPGW with. So if you look at the picture that's here, you'll see, and what you're going to find out is that every one of these anchors that are in our industry are designed to a certain specification that has a radius on the eye and a thickness on the anchor that is designed to accommodate the radius and the bend that's in that preform. So if you can maintain the bend in that preform, then it's not going to come unwrapped. But if you allow it to bend and to straighten out like the picture you see above, it is going to come unwrapped and it is going to come apart. Now, how could something like that happen? I would imagine that if we have, we have 14,000 people that are, you said that are part of this. I would imagine that the majority of them don't know what I just told you about these guy preforms. Now, why is that? Well, that might be because maybe our safety and training people aren't reading all of the details. I mean, and I can tell you too, when we were discussing this presentation, one of the things that I learned from Bureau was that they frequently get devices back or instruments back that said that it didn't work. And when they go out and test them in their live line yard, it worked just perfectly. And they find out that the problem was not the instrument, it was the instrument user, because the instrument user never read the directions on all of the things you're supposed to do in order to make that instrument perform the way that it's supposed to. In other words, we start using things and tools and equipment outside of what it was designed for. Here's a graphic that came from an incident that I investigated probably a dozen years ago. This is a highway where a rope pull went bad. The rope was lost and came down across the interstate and hooked a pickup truck going 70 miles an hour, pulled the rest of the rope down, pulled all kind of travelers and insulators and transformers off of about 5 spans of poles before the pickup truck managed to get stopped. Now, the reason why that happened? Because they were using dead-end grips for conductor to hold rope. If they had read the printed right in the side of the grip told you what what that grip is supposed to be used for. Nothing else. In other words, the manufacturer went out of their way to put it right on the grip, make it real easy for you to see. You don't have to go get a book. You don't have to go get a cut sheet to look it up. It's right there on the grip on what you're supposed to use it. So what we're doing is we might be clever and call that repurposing. We're using it for something else. And then we use it for something else, and it turns out it worked a whole bunch of times, and it worked really, really good until the day that it didn't. And the day that it didn't, it dropped it across the 70-mile-an-hour highway and got caught by a pickup truck and did a whole lot of damage. Lucky that nobody got killed. I went to a job where wire had been temporarily dead-ended overnight. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, that wire came down across the highway, and I had to call out a crew and the fire department and everybody else, and a couple of cars hit it. And what happened was the wedge grip failed. Now, take a look at this wedge grip. And by the way, this is a lightweight wedge grip that was designed way back around 1960, 1970, back when we did everything with hot sticks. Nobody was gloving. Now, because of the number of failures of wedge grips, they weigh about twice as much and they're about twice as big. But you know how a wedge grip works. It has a cast body, and then it has a soft bronze brass wedge on the inside, and you tap that wedge to open and close the grip. But what do you see on the face of this aluminum right here? That's hammer strikes. Somebody is hitting the wedge. I'm not hitting the wedge, but they're hitting the body of the cast instrument. And if you look very, very, very close, you'll see that there's actually a fracture mark running across the surfaces, highlighted with red with a fracture indicator. And then if you look at the brass, you'll see that when this grip broke, only part of the brass that was holding was this very small edge right here in the corner of that brass. Well, here's what happened. We put it in the lab and we did a test. And we found out that if you put a wedge grip this way along the conductor, and if you hit the wedge on the brass, then the wedge just moves back and forth. But if you hit the body, when you hit the body, the wedge grip goes sideways. Well, if the wedge grip goes sideways, where's it putting tension? It's putting tension right here on the weakest part of the wedge at the taper where the clevis was. We're not supposed to hit the body, we're supposed to hit the wedge. But somebody at some time, and I tell you, it wasn't the first time, because look at all of the, you see that little waffle mark that comes off of the waffle end of a, off of a framing hammer that they were hitting this with. And we found 4 of these wedge grips on this crew post-incident, and all of them had these same kind of same kind of waffle marks on them from the bodies being stripped. So we're using things not the way that we're supposed to use them, and a lot of it has to do with we don't know why we're doing what we're doing. So I'm going to introduce you to a couple of principles for success. And these are two of my favorite sayings that have evolved over the years that I've been doing these investigations that I've been teaching and also been counseling or mentoring safety or writing policies and procedures. Here's a very important principle for trainers to understand and for linemen to use. The first principle is, you don't know what you don't know. Now, you may be the quote, the Lineman's Cableman's Handbook Bible chapter by verse, and you're really, really good at line work. But what you don't know is why the equipment that you use was designed the way that it was. All of that equipment that you have on your truck and hanging in your belt was tested over and over and over under certain conditions until they came up with the design that you use. You don't need to know that because you have an operator's guide and you have training that says, use it this way. Don't use it any other way. Use it this way. So you don't know what you don't know, which is the design limitations of the equipment that you are reconfiguring or repurposing because it works better this way than it does that way. This is one of the things that we see constantly over and over and over is a misapplication of equipment or tools that was the mechanism of the incident that caused the incident to occur. So, if you don't know what you don't know, make your decisions on what you do know. If you absolutely know that this is the way you're supposed to use an 8-ton hoist, then you're not ever going to make a mistake and use it the way that it is not designed to be used, because there's a limit to what that hoist will do. And it's the same thing whether it's a strap hoist or whether it's a guy anchor or whether it's a preformed guy. There is a limit to what it's supposed to do. Now, how do we find out what those limits are? Well, it's all right there. Now, this isn't necessarily your job as the lineman. This is where the trainers and the policy writers are supposed to go to work. I have on my computer probably close to 80 consensus standards. Consensus standards are created by a team of industry professionals, and many times there's 30 people on one of these groups. They look at issues in the industry. They look at equipment being used in the industry. They get professionals from all manner of disciplines, from PhDs in physics all the way through to welders and linemen. And they discuss and come to a conclusion on what is the proper or best way to design, build, and use the equipment we use in the field. You see a couple of them right here, rigging hardware. Every clevis that you use, every hook that's on every hoist conforms to ASME B3026. Now, you don't have to know that, but your trainers should. The people who write your policies should have read this. And if you read that, then you make sure that the policies and procedures that you use fall in line with the limitations that are established by that consensus standard. Mobile elevating work platforms, ANSI SAIA A92.22. This is the standard for insulating buckets, bare hand buckets, non-insulating buckets, how they're to be designed and built and used. Look at the one below that, ASTM, which has a lot of standards on construction. Standard specification for fiberglass reinforced plastic, FRP, rod and tube, used in live line tools. You might be good at writing a maintenance program for your hot sticks, but if you haven't read this standard, then you don't know what the limitations are on those sticks. So you're more or less making a guess at what it is your crews are going to be doing. And if they're relying on you and you're making a guess, we might be heading toward a problem. And then the last one I have over on the left-hand side, there's Beerer's PD Series All-Purpose Utility Meter. It's the operating instructions. I don't know how many of you would be willing to go look at your beer meter and see how many fingerprints there are on that operating instruction, see how many times it's been used. Because when I go to a crew and I look at the operating instructions for a bucket truck or a digger derrick truck, you most all the time find out that the body of the material is still in a plastic wrapper. Nobody ever looked at it. And one of the biggest surprises that we find is that all outriggers, and this is a real good example, are not the same. For instance, one manufacturer, because of the elevation of the boom and the weight of the boom, says you must completely unload the tires and support the unit on the outriggers. Where another one from the same company says barely break the bend in the sidewall. Now, what's the difference between the two? Well, according to the manufacturer, that's what's going to keep it upright while you're working at it. But nobody ever read it to find out what it's supposed to be. So if I go out to an incident or do an audit on a crew and I ask 8 people there, hey, what's the primary configuration for setting the outriggers on this truck? And one of them will say, just get tires off the ground. Another one will say, well, just take a little bend out of it. Another one will say, well, as soon as they start to move, stop. But nobody knows because nobody looked it up. And even in their training, it was left out. So this is where the kind of things that we see that don't work when we try to, or when we misapply because we don't know what the limitations are that we find in the consensus standards. Now keep in mind, OSHA is the rules that we have to work, and it's what we are trying to accomplish. The consensus standards are the best practices that the industry uses in order to comply with the OSHA standard. So the next thing we have is, besides the consensus standards and operating goals, is your own materials that you have at your organization. So you look on the left, grounding for worker protection, policies and procedures. You know, we do a lot of training, and it's unfortunate because I didn't know this guy would be involved, but I was doing grounding training for 2 days for one of our clients, and we had helped them develop a compliant grounding program. And in the back of the room, there was 2 guys, and they were always on the phone sending stuff back and forth, and they were sending stuff to other people in the room. There was about 20 of them that were in there. A year later, that man killed himself on an induction incident. I don't know if he had been paying attention whether it made a difference or not, but I can tell you that when I sit in a classroom and I'm sharing this information and I'm telling you how linemen get killed, I'm wondering to myself, why do I have to apologize or try to create some sort of a creative element to get this guy engaged? Shouldn't we be paying attention and say, hey, this guy's here to explain something to us, to help us? And it's no different than your safety people, because when we're mentoring safety people, we hear the same thing all the time. They say, well, why are you guys doing this? They say, well, because if I tell them we can't do that anymore, they'll never let me back on the job. That's the wrong attitude. We're heading in the wrong direction. There's a reason why we have policies and procedures. These policies and procedures, just like this one here, is based on the consensus standards, and it's based on what we know in the industry will kill you. So we want to make sure that that's not going to happen by giving you the resources you need to stay safe. It's no different transmission line hot stick program. And then over on the right, your safety manual. Now, here's about the part about what you do know. If you know your safety manual, and if you know your programs and procedures and your policies, the decisions you make are going to be based on that information, the things you do know. You're never going to be held at fault for making the wrong decision if you're basing it on what you do know because of the training that you have received. Now, for you safety and training people, this is part of your job. At the end of 1910-269, you'll find Appendix G. Appendix G is a list of consensus standards that OSHA has provided this list to help the employer find ways to perform work that will bring them in compliance with the OSHA standard. Now, some of you may have heard before that there is a thing called adopted standards and there's a thing called recognized standards. OSHA, since 2014, no longer adopts standards. When they adopted a standard, then that standard had the weight of OSHA law, and you could actually cite an employer for failing to follow a consensus standard. That's not the case anymore. OSHA took that out, and now they just have these reference documents that they refer to, but it comes with this disclaimer that's in the box. The references contained in this appendix provide information that can be helpful in understanding and complying with the requirements contained in 1910-269. The National Consensus Standards referenced in this appendix contain detailed specifications that employers may follow in complying with the more performance-rated requirements of 1910-269. And then the very next statement says that the employer should be aware that compliance with a consensus standard does not necessarily indicate compliance with an OSHA standard. So you have to be very, very careful. I can tell you that the consensus standards are used by OSHA when they're trying to figure out what it was you were supposed to be doing. They will not cite you for not following a consensus standard, but they may cite you under what's known as the general duty clause. They can cite you under the general duty clause, and they'll use language out of the consensus standard, but they will not use the consensus standard in the citation. So this is important. These trainers, it's not a matter of bring in your 20 years of experience and go out there and teach. It's research. Do the research. Make sure that you understand what it is that we're supposed to be doing. Here's a list of some of those, and no, I don't expect you to read that list. But you can see it's heavily populated with ANSI, ASME, IEEE, ASTM, and everything you could possibly want to know about line work is in those consensus standards. So that's Appendix G at the end of 1910-269. Go through there, pick out a few at a time. They're not free. You do have to pay about $30 or $40 a piece. Some of them are even more than that. But it will give you all the information you need in order to examine your standards to make sure that what you are doing is in the best mode of compliance that you can possibly make it. So remember those principles for success that we had earlier? You don't know what you don't know. And then the other part of that was, so make your decisions based on what you do know. Well, here's the second principle for success. And we call it rigor and discipline. Rigor and discipline. Rigor is all that training that you've had. Your apprenticeship for 4 years, all of the training that you've had since then, all of the standards that your company provides for you, your safety manual. This is all rigor. This is how we do stuff. The discipline part is there is no other way but by way of the standards and the safety manual. See, if you will make decisions based on what you do know, and if you will maintain a level of discipline about conducting the work the way that our policies and procedures say we should, then you're going to be successful throughout your career, and you're going to leave that legacy as somebody who really knew what they were doing and really took care of their crews. So when we talk about this, I want to ask this question, then I'm going to tell you a story. So how does this rate to accountability? Well, when we do get it right every time, then for the accountability to our crew, we have done them a good turn. In other words, we're not creating or setting up that crew for failure. And that includes just co-workers. You don't have to be a foreman to do this. Linemen should be doing this same thing. The next one is our community, because it's our community that depends on us keeping the lights on. And if we're constantly burning stuff down because we're doing it wrong, then we're not doing them any favors at all. What we're doing is creating delays, and as linemen, we're proud of keeping the lights on. and we're proud of the work that we do. But if we go on there and we mess it up, then there's not much to be proud of. So your crew, your community, and then your family. So now I need to tell you a story. About 2 years ago, I was at we'd already done the OSHA side, and now we were in civil litigation. This was an incident where 2 linemen were killed in the same incident. It had been in trial or preparation for trial for a little over 4 years. I was the expert witness. I did what the legal community calls the forensics on the electrical incident. I reinvestigated, and what usually happens when we go to court, especially over one of these multi-million-dollar things, is that the opposite side, which in this case was a plaintiff, tries to discredit or have the expert witnesses dismissed. And so they go through a bunch of motions before the trial starts and try to have a certain, an expert removed. And they did that with me. And the judge asked me a series of questions. And then the judge said, I find him to be a qualified, credentialed expert, and we're going to proceed with the trial. Now, the family of the deceased, both of them were in the courtroom. And this isn't like Perry Mason. There's not a whole lot of people in there with just an interest of watching a trial. It's always just the family that's in there. And that family had been convinced that if somebody died on that job, which was their husband's, that it had to be that employer's fault. And the family has a nature of agreeing with that. Because, when you go home for dinner, do you sit there with your family and tell them, I'd be surprised if they let me back at work tomorrow. I'm the worst lineman that ever showed up on this job site. I can't believe they let me stay on this job. No. You go in there and tell them that nobody else knows what you do. If you weren't there, they'd never get anything done. You don't know how long they stayed in business this long without you. See, if something happens to you on the job, your family doesn't think that it was your fault. They think that it was somebody else's fault. And now they have some attorney that comes by and tells them, yeah, that's the case. They were at fault and you deserve to be taken care of and compensated. So they know who I am because they just saw me go through all the questions that happened, with that judge. Now, the first day of trial, they showed up with their family and with their children, which happens all the time because that's part of, helping a jury to get to know the family. And then as we went through the trial, on about the third day, the children quit coming in. And I saw the attitudes of the family change. And on the third day, I spent most of the day on the witness stand explaining what had happened. And by the end of the day, that family had gone through the loss of their spouse all over again, but in a different way. Because they realized that it wasn't the employer. They realized that they had lost both of their husbands, fathers, best friends because of choices that they made on the job. And now they were going to have to go through it all over again. I had never really thought of it or seen it from that perspective until I watched these families going through this emotional turmoil that they were going through as the realization struck them. So it's almost like everybody that's watching today and everybody that's going to see these in the future, when you left your family today, were you planning on abandoning them and never going back? That's not what we do. We expect to go home. And if we're on a storm break and doing storm work, at the end of that 2 weeks, we expect to go back home and your family expects you to be there. Now, we used to make it, I'm going to add some levity to try to bring you out of the funk that I just put you in. When I was a contractor, I was a foreman, and I had a safety guy to come out all the time and say, we want you to go home the same way you came to work. And I thought that was kind of funny because half of my linemen came to work drunk, and I really didn't want them going home, that same way. That's not what the reality is. We want you to come home. We want you to come home to your family. And the difference is the decisions that you're going to make during the day. So when we find out in almost every investigation that we do that somebody didn't do something that they were supposed to do, it's because they had the wrong information or they made the wrong choice. So that's where these principles come from. If you don't know what you don't know, you're setting yourself up. So make your decisions based on what you do know, and then understand and accept that rigor and discipline, because everything that you need to do your job is written down somewhere. And if you didn't remember what it is, it's easy enough to go back and find it. Or just ask the people who know, that'll give you the guidance that you need. So I want you to make those decisions. I'm ready to retire. I'd love to be put out of work, but I got too much work to do, and I got work to do because people are making bad decisions. So I just as soon be out of work. But most of all, you're my brothers. I've been doing this for a long time, and it frustrates me to no end to see my brothers out there getting hurt and getting killed on a job when we don't have to do that. So do your decisions on what you do know, understand that rigor, be that disciplined person that there's no other way to do it except the right way. And we'll all just get along just fine and go home when you're supposed to. Thanks a lot.